Oh man, do we have a lot to cover today, and I've just rolled off a plane from Norway, so who knows if I'll even be coherent. But okay, you all know the rules. This is the exciting live action portion of the show where I tell you all the tiny fibs we made and regale you with tales of historical daring do, or at least tell some anecdotes. So first off, flags. If you see a British flag, be suspect. So I'm just basically gonna leave it at that and never mention British flags again, in part because I'm totally to blame. I write the words, but half the time I'm on the road, and so I don't get to end up double checking the art before it airs. If there's ever a conflict between the two, trust the words, because when I screw those up, you know it's coming up in lies at least. But okay, so on to the first big one. I was super glad to see that a bunch of you caught in the first episode when I started talking about Barter. I sort of seeded it in there because I really wanted to talk about it, but the first time I wrote these episodes, whether or not Barter was a real thing, it took up an entire episode, and so I had to cut it. But hence lies. So the idea that early societies worked entirely with a barter economy is sort of something that Adam Smith made up kind of out of thin air. And because he's had such a seismic impact on modern economic thinking, we basically took this off-the-cuff conjecture of his as fact forever. And then some anthropologists actually looked at it and essentially said, we can find 0 instances of barter-based societies. So then a bunch of archaeologists took a look at it and basically said, well, we find a ton of evidence for relatively long distance trade, even among very early societies. So how do you explain that, right? Because you'd think that any kind of sort of communal sharing or even a trust credit economy where I give you fish today and you give me a loaf of bread whenever the harvest comes in, that sort of thing would only work locally, where you knew and interacted with the people around you, right? So right now, as far as I can tell, and I'm no expert on this at all, we've sort of come to rest on a theory of gift giving with a little bit of haggling as the mode for early economies, but it's both a hot topic among academics and there's sort of little discussion of it at the lay level. So I just wanted to bring it up here because I found it so fascinating. The other thing I did was shorthand a bit on how fractional reserve banking actually works, right? In the very, very specific details. I said that you deposit $1,000 because your bank only needs to hold 10% in reserve. It can now lend out $10,000. What actually happens is you put in $1,000, it can now lend out $900 holding that 10% in reserve, and when it gets it back, it can now lend out an additional $810 above that, right? So $1,710 in total, because it still has to hold 10% of the now $1,900 it has in reserve. This becomes an asymptotic curve after a bunch of transactions means that in the end, the bank will be able to lend out $10,000 off that $1,000 you put in. But with the volume of transactions happening in modern banks, this is basically instant. And a lot of the economic models I looked at essentially assumed that the economy operates at close to full fractional reserve capacity. So for simplicity's sake, you can basically think of it as, I put $1,000 into the bank can now lend out $10,000. Unless you're trying to take some very thorough model of the economy at a very, very sort of specific snapshot in time. Which leads us to talk about fractional reserve banking in general. There are people out there who are very adamant that we should do away with it entirely and go back to the way things were before. But this is sort of like saying that we should do away with electricity because you're worried about anthropogenic global warming. Yes, some of the concerns are totally legitimate, but the response is not super well thought through. Both of these technologies, and you really have to think about innovations in finance as technology, can, like all of mankind's technologies, be used well, but also have the potential to do harm. A systemic banking collapse, because there's a giant run on the banks, which the banks can't cover because of the fractional reserve system, is unlikely. with the right oversight and handling of this technology, it becomes virtually impossible. And we can argue all day about whether we've achieved a high enough level of regulation. And that's a hugely important and totally valid discussion, just as it is with our use of electric energy. But the whole world uses this system today, and it's allowed us to expand our economies to where they are right now. To simply try and turn back the clock is, I believe, impossible, and if achievable, would be disastrous. Oh, and then there's the argument about income inequality, which crops up around fractional reserve banking sometimes. And I totally feel that argument about distribution of wealth. It's a really important topic. But it's always weird to me when people tie that to fractional reserve banking, because the truth is, there is no country in the world, no matter how liberal, no matter how well and equally distributed the income, that requires full reserve banking. And if you go back and look at a time before fractional reserve banking, income distribution wasn't any better. In fact, it was a lot worse. And it's easy to pin everything on fractional reserve banking because it feels like, oh, those bankers just get to invent money out of thin air while the rest of us have to work for it. But when you need a loan to start a business or buy a car so you can get to a new job, it's that fractional reserve expansion of the money supply that's what's getting you that loan. Without it, there just physically is no money there a lot of the time to give you that loan, which in turn means you sort of can't bet on yourself and your new business. And I don't even mean to be defending fractional reserve, right? It was just weird that it came up so much because I'm not saying it's perfect by any means. I mean, heck no, it's not at all. There are all sorts of dangers and flaws associated with it, but that's also true of practically any technology. And the answer isn't to just go back to the old ways any more than it is to give up on electricity to save us from global warming. We need to find better answers. But, all right, let's jump back to the episodes because there's some rad stories here. First up, episode 2. I had the hardest time figuring out what was going on because certain ancient Chinese coins are called cash. But this is totally etymologically distinct from our English word cash. And by the way, it's only called cash in English. And so I would be reading these books and they'd be talking about cash. And then they'd talk about some completely other form of money. And I'd be like, what? Wait, there's money that isn't cash money? And besides sounding like I was talking about Lil Wayne's recording label, I ended up deeply confused. And then I found out that the English word cash comes from the Tamil word for coin and means a very specific type of Chinese coin, whereas our word cash, spelled exactly the same way, comes from the French word for money box. Confusing. And get this. I mean, as I said, this is only in English. In Chinese, there's a completely different word that sounds totally different for this same coin and is non-confusing. But only in English, where we have another word for that is cash, do we call them cash. But okay, on to a less confusing but equally hilarious note. The first paper money in China was often referred to as flying money because people hadn't totally gotten a handle on the whole wallet thing. And so sometimes they would take out their money and the wind would just blow it away because nobody was used to paper money. And you know that fellow who got strangled with a bowstring? Well, he really was much into innovation. And when he copied the Chinese paper money, he really copied it. Like, right down to the Chinese characters. And so the money in what is now in the middle of Iran had Chinese characters on it. And those goldsmiths that basically became banks in episode 3, I think. Many of those informal banks did actually become the first official banks as they found out that holding and lending money was actually a better racket than shaping gold. What else? Oh, okay, also in episode 3, that might have been episode 2 actually. But anyway, also in episode 3, remember when I mentioned that the English established the Bank of England to help sort of massively expand the Navy? I read at least one really interesting theory that this helped kickstart the Industrial Revolution because they had to build new foundries to make enough nails and new clothwork to make all the sails. And when I mentioned that some of the ideas about paper money had been sort of in the milieu and kicking around, it was John Locke and David Hume. David Hume being one of my favorite philosophers. They had both touched on some of these ideas in their writing before Barban got to it. But to me, Barban is really the first to do it in a serious, sort of full exploration of this idea. And speaking of Barban, there are so many stories I couldn't fit in, but remember how I said that he did a few stints in Parliament to avoid prosecution? Well, at the time, you couldn't prosecute a sitting member of Parliament. And see, back in 1684, I think, he had his workers sort of set about one of the largest projects he had ever worked on, redeveloping Red Lion Square. There's only one teensy-tiny problem. He actually hadn't been authorized to do so. And of course, one of the Inns of Court, Gray's Inn, was right there on the square. And they didn't like this idea. So the lawyers of Gray's Inn rush out and begin a physical battle with the construction workers. And get this, the lawyers won. And of course, being lawyers, they immediately also set about trying to get Barban prosecuted, hence him running away to do a turn in Parliament. And mortgages. Mortgage literally translates to death pledge. And while the idea is that the death in it refers to the death of the loan once it's repaid, and not the death of the person taking out the loan, I figured it was one of those terms too aptly titled not to share. So let's move on to John Law, because I love this guy. I could have done so many more episodes on him. He's awesome. We didn't even scratch the surface. And so yeah, he's rad, even if he didn't sort of collapse an economy, you know. But remember how I talked about him getting a duel over a woman? Well, we're pretty sure that woman was the king's mistress. No one can quite confirm it because there's no absolute record of it, but most historians I've read can't see the circumstantial evidence any other way. And yes, if you're thinking, wait, neither Law nor the other fellow in the duel were the king, you're right. So there's that. Oh man, there's so much I want to talk about how he basically went to economic war with England and how his successes were actually part of what scared Britain into establishing the South Sea Company. And Walpole. Actually, there's a million Walpole things, but all that got cut, and it's gonna get cut again from here because I promised myself I would make sure to touch on all the important economic stuff. So let's move on to episode 5 and talk about the US Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was made in part to respond to what is called the US period of wildcat banking. During this period, there were no federal regulations on banks, so basically they all just issued their own banknotes, and many of them did it so profligately that they would just go bust all the time. And the US needed a reliable banking system to support its ever-growing commercial role in the world. So the Fed was created to issue a stable single banknote for the country to use and to serve as the lender of last resort for banks that were fundamentally sound, but momentarily couldn't meet the demands of their customers for cash because of a bank run. And this is supposed to be one of the checks on the fractional reserve system, right? One of the fears with fractional reserve banking is that it will allow a bank to lend out a lot more money than it has on hand. And then, if a ton of people all want to get out their money at once, the bank could collapse because it's lent out most of the cash that it owes to all the people who deposited money. Which in turn means that if the bank goes bust, anyone who didn't get their money out right away will be screwed. The Fed is supposed to solve this by essentially lending banks with good loans that they can eventually collect on enough liquid currency to meet short-term runs on the bank so this doesn't happen. And this is good for everybody. But it comes with one danger, something which is usually referred to as moral hazard. Because what happens when you start getting too lax with this? What happens if you stop being as rigorous about the fact that you're making sure that the banks you're acting as the lender of last resort to actually have good loans out there rather than wildly risky garbage? Well, you're not really acting as the lender of last resort then. You're just bailing out the banks. And when that happens, you hit moral hazard, which is the idea that people are very much more likely to do risky things if they know that they will get to reap the reward if the risk goes well, while at the same time not having to suffer the consequences if things go wrong. I mean, you're basically handing a gambler someone else's money and saying, if you win, you get to keep all of it. If you lose, you don't have to pay it back. And that's the root of the 2008 banking crisis. That's fundamentally what the whole credit default swap thing is, right? Banks making horrible garbage loans in the slim hope that they pay off, and then finding ways to package them up so they're hidden, so most of the world doesn't know, and then selling them as if they weren't horrible garbage loans. Until I guess the whole system is so flooded with garbage loans that don't actually pay off that the whole global economy collapses. And that behavior will just continue if you keep creating moral hazard of bailing out the banks. Because doing so means that high risk, high reward behavior just becomes high reward behavior. And I'm actually not one of those people who says we should just let the banks collapse, right? Again, that's one of those let's set fire to the house to get rid of the termite sort of solutions. And we can do better. But this doesn't mean that there were no answers, right? That we couldn't find a way to avoid the moral hazard by, say, holding the people at the highest ranking positions culpable for what happened to the global economy, or breaking up the banks by having the federal government basically buy the failing banks and then selling them back to other parts of the financial industry. Or when they recovered, to simply garnish earnings of the bank until they had paid what they owed the U.S. taxpayer, say twice or three times over. So we have to find a way to escape this moral hazard. Since we're talking about the Fed, there also seems to be some misconceptions about the private nature of the Fed. Many people seem to think that meant that the Fed was a standard for-profit bank. Well, it's really more of a semi-private corporation. It's essentially a private company whose board is appointed by the elected president of the United States, whose officers are split between being appointed by the federal government and nationally chartered banks, and whose stock, sort of by law, every nationally chartered bank has to buy into, for which they get a 6% dividend on their investment. And where every other cent of the profit the Federal Reserve Bank makes goes back to the federal government. Of the $100 billion in profit the Federal Reserve made last year, it gave $97 billion of it back to the government, i.e. saving the taxpayers $97 billion the government would have otherwise needed to raise to run. And so it's not what you usually think of when someone says corporate bank. That said, like all the others, right, this system is very far from perfect. All the moral hazard stuff I talked about comes about in part from the fact that while in theory the governing board of the bank is appointed by the president specifically to avoid the banks regulating themselves and having the option to bail themselves out, too often even the academics who are given these positions have ties to major players in the financial industry. And I'll admit, it's a tough problem. I mean, how do you get enough people who are qualified to manage something as economically complex as the Fed without them having practical experience in the field? But in my very admittedly layman's opinion, if you're looking to keep the banking system acting not in an altruistic manner, but at least in a responsible, self-serving manner, figuring out how to do that might be a good place to start. One last random thing about government agencies and attempts to minimize damage done by banks going belly up. Someone in the comments asked what FDIC Insurance was. It's basically a system of insurance that the government mandates every bank carry to protect sort of you, the depositor, from the bank going bust. Basically, if your bank fails and they can't repay you, the first $100,000 in your account will be paid back to you out of this federal insurance fund. I haven't even talked about the petrodollar yet. So on to episode 6 about the gold standard. The first thing that you have to know about the gold standard is that it's actually Isaac Newton's fault, or at least the move from silver to gold was. Britain was hemorrhaging gold in its foreign trade, and so needed to find a different standard. And Isaac Newton had been named Master of the Mint, which I think everybody considered basically a ceremonial job to pension off a famous old guy. But Newton took it very seriously, and soon he reformed the coinage, and because of the way he valued gold and silver, silver ended up being used almost entirely to buy imports, thus sort of continuing to flood out of the country. And this is a problem we'll see crop up in the Opium Wars and a number of other times. But it did mean that gold was the standard for the internal currency. And speaking of Newton, did I mention that he lost his shirt in the South Sea bubble and was miffed about it basically until his dying day? He wouldn't even talk about it. But okay, petrodollars. Then I'm going to collapse and fall asleep for 14 hours. Okay, so remember when I mentioned that people pegged their currency to the dollar after World War II because the dollar was the only thing left on the gold standard, because the US literally had more than half of the entire world's gold reserves in its vaults at that point. Well, a bunch of stuff happens, other economies get stronger, we drop some of our gold reserve, the gall kicks us in the teeth, and all of a sudden it doesn't make sense for us to be on the gold standard any longer. And I know some of you will shout, yes, the gold standard will always make sense, but honestly, after reading a ton on this, I can't really buy into that argument. And yes, it keeps inflation down, but the other costs are just too great, and I'll try and talk a little bit about inflation in a second. But petrodollars, gold standard. Anyway, we get off the gold standard. Now we're in fiat money territory, right? The money that works because we all agree it works territory. But there are some people who would argue that we're actually not on fiat money. And this is an interesting and totally legitimate point to consider, because in 1971, the very year we left the gold standard, OPEC, the coalition of oil-producing nations, arguably at the prodding of the US, decided that they would only take US dollars in exchange for oil. This meant the whole world needed US dollars to buy the oil that the world now ran on, essentially making the US dollar backed by oil, black gold instead of yellow, which raises huge questions about what happens to the dollar if the OPEC nations ever decide, as they've been thinking about doing, and some have to a very limited degree started to do, if they start accepting other currencies. If we're a true fiat currency, very little should happen. If we're still actually a commodity currency that just looks like a fiat currency, if we're still a commodity currency backed by oil, the currency should totally, just the bottom should drop out of the dollar if we lose that OPEC backing. My completely uneducated guess is that the dollar will take a hit, but it won't be catastrophic. Again, I am a total layman on this, but from what I've seen, I think enough people have believed in the dollar as a fiat currency for long enough that it's actually just truly become one. But I guess that'll lead me back to talking about the arguments for getting back on the gold standard. Basically, if your money's on the gold standard, you effectively have no inflation. This is great if you're super rich, because if you have inflation and your money's losing a few percent per year, that's a big deal if you're sitting on a huge pile of money, right? And it means that you're gonna have to keep working if you wanna maintain that pile of money. But if you're not super rich, it's less of a big deal because you tend to convert most of your income into stuff anyway. Anytime you use your money to pay the rent or buy a new TV or get a bite to eat or take a vacation, effectively that money is not affected by inflation for you because you've spent it, and inflation happens over time. Now, large amounts of inflation are bad for everybody because if you've got 10% inflation or whatever, that will eat right through whatever you've managed to put away to buy a house or a car or just saving up for a rainy day or retirement. But the small amounts of inflation like the US currently has at 1.5% is usually considered healthy by economists. Yes, it makes your savings worth a bit less every year, but it also ensures that the super wealthy don't just sit on their money and do nothing with it. It forces them to invest it in businesses or buy bonds from the government, putting that money to work for the economy rather than just hoarding it while a handful of people slowly live off of it. It doesn't do much to help the whole income inequality thing, but it at least makes sure that all of the society's money remains productive in an economic sense. Crud, I thought I was done. And it reminds me of one other thing I have to talk about before I can go meet the sweet embrace of unconsciousness. And that is exorbitant privilege. I am not going to do justice to this at all here, and it's super complicated, but I thought it was really interesting and so at least worth bringing up. But fundamentally, for quite a while, the US has been running what would normally be considered a completely unsustainable negative balance of accounts. We have way more imports than exports. There's more foreign investment in the US than there is US investment in foreign nations, et cetera, et cetera. Taken all together, in a ridiculously oversimplified form, it's sort of like a business spending more money than it makes. Usually that business either has to eventually cut spending or sell more stuff or go out of business. But here's where it gets crazy. Because the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency, there is an argument, first put forth by the French when they were still miffed about American economic dominance post-World War II, that the world using US dollars as their reserve currency gave us a ridiculous advantage. We could buy imports, goods from other countries, in our own currency. Now, normally, if France wants to buy something from Russia, the economy is going to have to export enough, the French economy is going to have to export enough to generate enough currency to buy enough Russian rubles to pay for whatever they want to buy. But if we in the US want to buy something from France or Russia because they need US dollars as their reserve, we can just buy it in US dollars, which means we don't have to export enough to cover buying enough foreign currency to cover what we're actually importing. And here's where it gets a little too complicated for me. This is really weird and I don't claim to fully know it. Don't trust me on this one. But as I understand it, that essentially means that to some degree, we can just print more money to buy things from other people. Not infinite, but a small amount. And normally printing money is a terrible idea unless you're expanding your economy. But what is the expansion of an economy? Additional goods and services. And what are we getting for the money we're printing? Additional goods and services. So basically, it's like we're using other countries' labor to expand our economy, or secretly making part of their economy ours, all because of the fact that everyone needs dollars. And the reality of this and the extent of its effect, if it's even real at all, is widely debated, and it's almost impossible to pin down. But the middle of the road stance seems to be that we're getting to write off about $50 billion a year in trade deficit because of this. But as mentioned, even that number would be hotly contested. Still, this idea of exorbitant privilege is an idea worth the examining. All right, now I think I'm free. Go check out the Kiners music because it should be up at the same time as this, and they did this incredible rendition of Simple Gifts. And check out Lil's art for this one, which cracked me up, and hopefully we're showing somewhere on this screen. And join us next week for the adventures of Simon Bolivar, Libertador, as he struggled to liberate South America, because it's an incredible tale. And so, yeah, I am going to go crash, but thank you all for sticking with us through an incredibly tough, incredibly sort of detailed as we can make it in 7-minute internet videos, which can't do justice to anything, series on economics. And you all should know that this was one of the toughest for me. I feel like I left an incredible amount out because we tried to cover thousands and thousands of years of super complicated economic history in 6 episodes. But just reading your comments was fantastic, and seeing how engaged people were by something that's normally considered as dry as economics. So I guess I will see you all next week. Take care, everybody.
And when we find ourselves in a place just